It was supposed to be a straightforward night mission in the Gulf of Tonkin. On the deck of USS Forrestal, American sailors wrestled 16 bombs into the ship's massive bomb farm, while 27 fully armed and fueled aircraft stood ready to strike North Vietnam. Training films said bombs like these were supposed to survive 10 minutes in burning jet fuel. A little manhandling here and there shouldn't do any harm. But these were no ordinary bombs. They were Korean War relics, packed with something called Composition B, and it was growing more unstable by the minute. In the summer of 1967, the air war over North Vietnam had reached its peak under Operation Rolling Thunder. Sailing off the Gulf of Tonkin, carriers launched endless daily strikes targeting bridges, supply depots, and rail lines, with 12,000 attack sorties flown from carriers only in the month of July. At the center of it all was the carrier striking arm of the United States Navy's 7th Fleet, Task Force 77. Stationed at Yankee Station, roughly 100 miles off the North Vietnamese coast, the force kept 2 or 3 carriers on the line at any given time, with a roster that included a mix of Essex-class and Kitty Hawk-class veterans like the Bonhomme Richard, Oriskany, Constellation, Ticonderoga, and Hancock. Inside these larger-than-life ships, countless crews worked around the clock to fuel, arm, and launch aircraft as fast as possible before the unpredictable weather forced them to stop. However, it was Washington's micromanagement that made the job even more difficult. The air war was managed all the way from the White House, where target lists and even approach routes were dictated from thousands of miles away. Carriers might launch dozens of sorties against the same bridge, all while MiG bases and missile sites sat untouched. In Hanoi and Haiphong, entire zones that were marked off limits, American reconnaissance flights could see Soviet freighters and their men, unloading missiles and fuel in the harbors in plain sight, cargo that soon armed the defenses, trying to take down Task Force 77's aircraft. Long deployments and relentless pace caused the safety rules to bend to keep the sorties flowing, and accidents were already mounting. A year earlier, a magnesium flare ignited inside the hangar of USS Oriskany when 2 sailors mishandled it during weapons offload, touching off a fire that took the lives of nearly 50 men. Other ships had lost planes to deck crashes, misfired ordnance, and more. By 1967, most carriers spent 75 to 80% of the year at sea. But now, Task Force 77 was about to receive something new, a supercarrier. Authorized in 1951 and commissioned in 1955, USS Forrestal, the lead ship of her class, was the first American supercarrier. While the Essex and Midway classes had been adapted to the jet age, their decks were crowded and their catapults underpowered. Forrestal was designed from the start to handle heavier aircraft, nuclear strike missions, and sustained air operations far from home waters. The carrier displaced nearly 60,000 tons at standard load, and more than 81,000 tons at full load, approximately 25% larger than the Midway class. Her flight deck stretched 1,039 feet in length and 252 feet wide, featuring 4 steam catapults and an angled landing area that allowed planes to launch and recover simultaneously. Forrestal could carry close to 90 of these aircraft, nearly half more than the wartime Essex class. At the time of her first deployment in the late 1950s, Forrestal was recognized worldwide as the United States Navy's leap into the jet age, and her early peacetime cruises set the pattern for Atlantic and Mediterranean deployments. Yet, in June 1967, the Norfolk-based carrier departed for her first ever combat deployment. With this, the supercarrier's skipper, Captain John K. Belling, a veteran aviator from World War II, led his ship and his roughly 5,000 men from sailors to the embarked air wing west. On July 25th, the ship steamed into Yankee Station, positioning alongside the other carriers at Task Force 77. That same morning, her catapults launched Douglas A-4 Skyhawks and McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs into the sky over the Gulf of Tonkin, striking supply lines, rail junctions, and storage depots with their sleek Mark 83 general-purpose bombs. The sailors and air crews alike, eager to prove themselves, adapted quickly to the tempo that older Pacific Fleet carriers had been enduring for months. For the next 3 days, USS Forrestal's aircraft flew more than 150 sorties without the loss of a single aircraft. By July 27th, Captain Belling could report an impressive debut performance to Fleet Command. Now, the ship's ammunition was running dangerously low. Thankfully, Another replenishment was already on the way. On July 28th, ammunition ship USS Diamond Head pulled alongside Forrestal to transfer ordnance for the next day's strikes. By then, the pace of Rolling Thunder had drained stocks of the newer Mark 80 series weapons, and carriers were being issued leftover ordnance from decades before. Among the weapons hoisted aboard that morning were 16,000-pound AN M65A1 bombs, nicknamed Fat Boys for their short, wide shape. Diamond Head had collected these bombs from Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines, where some had been sitting in storage for well over a decade, far from proper facilities and exposed in tropical heat and humidity. When Forrestal's ordnance handlers opened the transfer crates, they were shocked to see rust and grime coating the casings, still packed in their original crates from the 1950s, the wood now soft with rot. While the Mark weapon series had steel cases fitted with Composition H6, a stable explosive designed to withstand rough handling, the older AN M65A1s had thin cases packed with Composition B, an outdated explosive mixture that became increasingly unstable over time and could detonate from impacts that newer explosives would barely notice. Most disturbing of all, liquid paraffin, the waxy substance meant to stabilize the compound, was seeping from the seams of multiple bombs. Alarmed by what they saw, the ordnance handlers reported straight to Captain Belling, worried they were too unstable to be handled, let alone survive a catapult-assisted launch. But when the skipper demanded Diamond Head take back the deteriorating bombs in exchange for modern Mark 83s, the ammunition ship had none to offer. Faced with an impossible choice, Belling, knowing full well the operational demands of Rolling Thunder, and against the protests of his men, ordered all 16 bombs stored together on deck in the bomb farm, the long row of ordnance kept between the starboard rail and the carrier's island. One by one, handlers wrestled the corroded casings into dollies. Unknown to them, the devices weren't the only outdated component aboard Forrestal. For years after World War II, where the Pacific Ocean taught the Americans lessons they swore they'd never forget, every sailor learned basic firefighting as part of their training. However, by 1967, that approach had undergone a radical change. The Navy now used specialized damage control teams to handle emergencies, while the rest of the crew focused on their regular duties. Most sailors aboard Forrestal had never fought anything bigger than a wastebasket fire. Chief Aviation Boatswain's Mate Gerald Ferrier led Damage Control Team No. 8, the specialist responsible for flight deck firefighting. With 20 years in the Navy, Ferrier had worked his way up through the aviation ranks and knew carrier operations inside and out. His team had trained on Navy films showing modern ordnance surviving extreme heat, watching 1,000-pound bombs sit in burning jet fuel for 10 full minutes without detonating. Demonstrations that proved proper response procedures could control even major fuel fires. Those reassuring training films, however, featured only the modern Mark 83 bombs. Now, when morning came, jet engines roared to life for the first launch. The AN M65A1s, with their insides degrading by the hour, would be sitting a mere few feet away from dozens of exhaust streams, hot enough to buckle steel. July 29, 1967, began like USS Forrestal's previous days in Vietnam. All over the ship, her 5,000 men went about their routines. Some grabbed a quick meal, others cleaned equipment, while deep in the heart of the ship, the night crew slept soundly. By mid-morning, with the first strike of the day over and done with, it was time to prep for the next one. By 10:50 a.m., everything was ready to begin. On the deck were 27 aircraft, 12 A-4 Skyhawks, 7 F-4 Phantoms, and 2 RA-5C Vigilantes, waiting with full fuel tanks, their wings and fuselages loaded with rockets, missiles, and bombs. The models were packed so close that deck crews had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. Nearby, even more ordnance sat stacked on wooden pallets in the bomb farm, including those worrisome 16 AN M65s reluctantly wheeled into position the night before. Near the starboard quarter was a Phantom flown by Lieutenant Commander James Bangert and Lieutenant Lawrence McKay. Parked at an angle across the deck, the fighter carried LAU-10 rocket pods beneath its wings, each loaded with 4 Zuni rockets. Although these 5-inch unguided weapons were inexpensive, versatile, and widely available across the fleet, their finicky electrical systems had a reputation for being unreliable. Too much moisture or a stray voltage could slip past safeguards, even with the safety pins still in place. At 10:51 a.m., in a routine step to prepare his fighter for taxi, Pilot Bangert began the switch from external to internal power. But instead of a clean handover, the transfer sent a surge of electricity through worn wiring, and the Zuni rocket roared to life. Without any warning, the rocket burst from its pod and streaked across 100 feet of flight deck, trailing fire and white smoke. Hearing the noise, deck crews dove for cover, though one sailor felt the heat of the exhaust trail wash over his body as it passed by him. In a matter of a single second, the Zuni slammed into the fuel tank of Lieutenant Commander Fred White's Skyhawk, with the force of a sledgehammer, punching through the aluminum skin and rupturing the 400-gallon external tank. As jet fuel burst from the torn metal in a pressurized spray, it began spreading across the non-skid deck coating in an ever-expanding pool. Though the Zuni's warhead didn't detonate, the impact shattered the rocket's casing, and the burning propellant scattered in all directions, igniting the fuel instantly and creating a massive conflagration. The lake of fire washed beneath White's aircraft and another Skyhawk beside it, where Lieutenant Commander John McCain sat strapped in his cockpit, his canopy still open to the morning heat. All the while, another piece punctured the centerline fuel tank of a third Skyhawk near the catapult, adding even more fuel to the disaster. The flames spread with terrifying speed, only worsened by the 32-knot wind whipping across the ship. At 10:52 a.m., the fire alarm rang, followed moments later by general quarters, and men sprinted as fast as they could to battle stations. By 10:59 a.m., Forrestal had gone to the critical condition Zebra, her crew slamming shut the heavy steel doors that sealed the ship into compartments against fire and flooding. Beneath Lieutenant Commander White's burning Skyhawk, the sheer heat warped and twisted the bomb rack holding the 1,000-pound AN-M65s until the metal gave way entirely, and one of the bombs tore free from its shackles and dropped straight down into the lake of burning fuel. According to witnesses, only moments later, another one tumbled out from Lieutenant Commander McCain's aircraft. Now, 2 aging Korean war bombs, with dangerously unstable Composition B cores, were sitting at the heart of the fire spreading between the aircraft. By then, Damage Control Team Number 8, led by Farrier, was already moving. Knowing full well the dangers of burning jet fuel, without stopping to grab protective gear, Farrier ran straight toward the heat, armed with only a purple foam extinguisher. His men followed suit, dragging hoses across the deck, everyone still believing they had 10 minutes to prevent a cook-off. As Farrier fought the flames, trying to buy time for the men still trapped in their cockpits, the pilots in the line of fire clawed desperately at their harnesses. McCain, knowing there was no time for a ladder, stood in his seat, scrambled along the spine of the jet, grabbed the refueling probe, and swung himself down, dropping the last 8 feet to the deck and rolling clear. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Robert Browning had no way out but through. He climbed from his Skyhawk into walls of fire, sprinted across the deck, and dove beneath the tails of parked Phantoms, using their bulk as shields. All around the deck, the fire teams worked as fast as they could, but Farrier, closer than anyone, could see something they couldn't from their positions. Beneath the purple foam, the bomb's casing had begun to change color. Now the metal was glowing. When a crack appeared in the bomb's skin and a bright white light leaked through, Farrier desperately shouted for his firefighters to withdraw, but it was too late. According to Aviation Boatswain's Mate 3rd Class Gary L. Shaver, quote, "There was a 1,000-pound bomb lying on the deck, surrounded by burning fuel. Suddenly, there was an explosion." Only 1 minute and 36 seconds after the fire started, the AN-M65 detonated. The blast of the broken-down bomb made Forrestal and all her 81,000 tons lurch sideways, tearing a massive crater in the flight deck. From one moment to the next, Farrier and most of his team simply ceased to exist, vaporized at the center of the detonation. McCain had just turned to help another pilot who was on fire, and the blast wave picked him up like a doll and threw him backward 10 feet. As he struggled to stand, shrapnel tearing through his flight suit, though in pain, with his ears ringing, McCain knew his own escape had been pure luck. White was gone, as were every single one of the 7 Phantoms. Lieutenant Commander Robert Browning barely made it back, later recalling, quote, "The port quarter of the flight deck where I was is no longer there." But the worst was not over just yet. Only seconds later, 2 more 1,000-pound AN-M65s detonated almost simultaneously, making the beleaguered Forrestal shudder once more. 44 seconds later, a 4th bomb exploded. Sailors later described it as watching the ship being hit by invisible torpedoes, each impact shaking the massive carrier from stem to stern. In the next few minutes, the rest of the ordnance began to cook off. Another 1,000-pounder detonated near the island, then 2 more in quick succession by the port rail. A smaller 750-pound bomb followed seconds later, its blast merging with a 500-pounder that went off almost simultaneously. On the aircraft that hadn't yet been destroyed by the bomb blasts, the spreading heat caused rocket motors to ignite and shoot across the deck like horizontal fireworks before exploding. Others never left their rails at all, their casings splitting and scattering shrapnel into nearby ordnance. Near the crater from the initial blast, an old and volatile A&M 65 sat directly beside a newer Mark 117. When the former detonated, the blast wave slammed into the modern weapon, and despite its superior design, it simply couldn't withstand a point-blank explosion. As both bombs went off together, their separate blasts merged into one massive detonation. The combined fireball climbed higher than the island structure, bright enough to hurt the eyes of the sailors watching in awe from nearby ships. Each detonation made firefighting impossible. Sailors with hoses would advance toward the flames, only to dive for cover as another bomb cooked off. By then, no less than 7 holes now gaped in the flight deck. Through these openings, 40,000 gallons of burning jet fuel cascaded like waterfalls of fire into the hangar bay and breathing spaces below. The uncontrolled burning spread to the compartments where the exhausted night crew slept. They found themselves trapped behind warped hatches or in compartments already filled with smoke and flames. Above, sailors who had never trained for this magnitude of disaster took over from the now decimated damage control teams. Working on instinct and adrenaline, they formed chains to roll 250 and 500-pound bombs, glowing cherry red and threatening to explode across the deck and over the side. Men grabbed burning rockets with their bare hands and threw them into the sea. Aircraft with their engines still running were pushed overboard. $1-million jets sacrificed to prevent their fuel from feeding the inferno. By then, coordination had broken down completely, with sailors manning fire hoses and using seawater to wash away the firefighting foam that other teams had carefully laid down to smother fuel fires. In the midst of the uncontrolled chaos, nobody was in charge. Nobody knew the full picture. Not even Captain Belling, who, from the bridge, did his best to direct the crews despite confusing and contradictory reports. For the entire day, everyone simply fought the piece of disaster in front of them, hoping someone, somewhere, had a plan to save the ship. Outside Forrestal's burning hull, every ship in Task Force 77 turned toward the disaster. Destroyers that had been screening miles away now raced toward the smoke column, rising thousands of feet into the sky. USS George K. Mackenzie arrived first, her crew pulling burned and drowning men from the oil-slicked water, while training every available fire hose on Forrestal's inferno. Commander Edwin Burke ordered his destroyer, USS Rupertus, to maneuver alongside the burning carrier, closing to just 20 feet despite the risk of collision or explosion. For 90 minutes, Rupertus and her brave men held position in the choppy seas, the hull scraping against Forrestal's side, while her crew aimed high-pressure streams at the flight deck and hangar bay fires. Rear Admiral Harvey Lanham, watching from Forrestal's bridge, called Burke's actions, quote, an act of magnificent seamanship. At 11:47 a.m., nearly an hour after the first explosion, Forrestal finally reported the flight deck fires under control. 30 minutes later, crews had beaten back the last flames topside, though smoke still poured from the holes blown through the deck. Below, fires still raged through compartments that would burn for hours more. As the afternoon wore on, unexploded ordnance kept popping up among the wreckage. Lieutenant Robert Cates, Forrestal's explosive ordnance disposal officer, was analyzing the deck when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. As he recalled, quote, there was a 500-pound bomb and a 750-pound bomb in the middle of the flight deck that were still smoking. They hadn't detonated or anything, they were just sitting there smoking. So I went up and defused them and had them jettisoned. Another live bomb was discovered 3 decks down. It had fallen through one of the blast holes. Then a sailor, whose name was never recorded, volunteered to let himself be lowered on a rope through the jagged hole in the deck. While fires still burned in adjacent compartments, while smoke filled the space so thick he couldn't see his own hands, he dangled in the darkness. Working by touch alone, he found the bomb's fuse and carefully removed it. Only then did his shipmates pull him back up, coughing and retching, but alive. For hours, medical teams performed triage as best as they could to treat the overwhelming casualties. In conditions that ranged from burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation, and blast trauma, filling every available bed and then the floors between them. When they were overwhelmed, USS Henry W. Tucker pulled alongside to escort Forrestal toward a rendezvous with the hospital ship Repose, where the most critical cases could be transferred. At 5:05 p.m., officers began the grim task of mustering the crew. The official count took all night. Men were scattered across multiple ships, some in sick bays, others pulled from the water by destroyers. Some would never be found. Finally, just past 4 in the morning on July 30th, after nearly 14 hours, the last fire was declared out. Morning light revealed the full scope of destruction. Of 73 aircraft aboard, 21 were destroyed, 7 Phantoms, 11 Skyhawks, and 3 Vigilantes. Another 40 were damaged beyond immediate repair. The toll stood at 134 lost sailors, with 161 more wounded badly enough to require extended treatment. In Hangar Bay 1, relatively undamaged but still reeking of smoke, the chaplains held a memorial service. More than 2,000 of Forrestal's surviving crew stood in rows, many still in the same charred and smelly uniforms they'd worn through the firefight, listening to prayers for shipmates who'd eaten breakfast beside them just 24 hours before. On July 30th, 1967, the day after the disaster, Forrestal stood as a scarred giant. The explosions had torn open the flight deck, leaving gaping holes through to the levels below. Fire and blast had buckled steel plating, warped support beams, and filled compartments deep inside the ship with smoke and water damage. Too badly hurt to remain on station, she headed for full repairs at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where she would stay for months. Following the disaster, the Navy convened an investigation panel that quickly identified a cascade of procedural failures. The pressure to maintain sortie rates in Vietnam had created an environment where sailors routinely bent or ignored safety procedures across the fleet. The most damning discovery came from the ship's own records. Only 4 weeks before the fire, Forrestal's Weapons Coordination Board had decided to speed up launch operations by allowing ordnance crews to connect the Zuni rocket's electrical firing circuits while aircraft still sat parked on deck, rather than waiting until they reached the catapult, as regulations required. This change bypassed a critical safety barrier, and no one ever passed it to Captain Belling for approval. While the investigation panel officially absolved Belling from responsibility, the Navy ended his career at sea. The loss of 134 men finally forced change across the U.S. Navy. The fleet installed remote-controlled firefighting systems on flight decks, made damage control training mandatory for all sailors, and completely withdrew the last of the old World War II bombs, replacing them with ordnance able to withstand the heat and shock of carrier operations. Forrestal returned to the fleet in April 1968 and resumed a steady rhythm of deployments for the next few decades, alternating between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, standing watch during crises from the Middle East to the Cold War standoffs in Europe, until finally, in 1993, with the Cold War over and the Navy reshaping its fleet, the Navy decommissioned Forrestal.